A legend involving an ancient doomsday prophecy could be interpreted to say Pope Francis's death marked the last head of the Catholic Church, but don't get too worried. The legend traces back to a 12th-century Irish saint, St. Malachy, and a long list of foretold popes, beginning in the 1100s and ending after 112 popes. Experts say there are lots of flaws in the prediction. St. Malachy has received renewed attention because Francis, who died on April 21 at the age of 88, could mark the 112th pope on that list. That means, depending on how the list is interpreted, this could be the first time in nearly 1,000 years there is no new pope foretold by St. Malachy. The prophecy has sparked the imagination of believers, Catholic and otherwise, at several successions of popes. In 2018, it received attention when the History Channel aired a documentary called The Last Pope. A 1922 New York Times report claimed the prophecies truly pictured the three most recent popes. Experts, however, generally don't put much stock in the legend. The most prominent red flag: Malachy probably didn't even write the list, which entered the historical record hundreds of years after his death. The prophecies are a forgery, said Father James Weiss, an Episcopal priest and professor of church history at Boston College. Problems with St. Malachy legend arise quickly. The text in question is a list of 112 phrases said to be associated with popes, beginning with Celestine II, who was named pope in 1143, Weiss said. The popes are not specifically named. Examples of the phrases include, swift bear, and rose of Umbria. From Malachy's time through the late 16th century, when historians largely believe the list was actually written, the descriptions are quite accurate, Weiss said. After that, however, it's hit or miss, with some examples appearing to line up to real popes and others that are much more of a stretch. The 112th pope was described as Peter the Roman. The prophecy goes on in a short paragraph to describe what some interpret to be the end of the world, or second coming, of Jesus. The paragraph describes the destruction of the city of seven hills, presumably Rome, and a dreadful judge. Weiss said the common doomsday interpretation of the paragraph could be entirely off. It could refer to a non-apocalyptic event and perhaps judgment by a nation's leader. John Hogue, who runs a blog on prophecies and sells private readings, appeared in the History Channel documentary as a believer in the prediction, calling it highly accurate. In general, historical and religious scholars don't put much stock in it. The time between Malachy's life and the first historical mention of the prophecy is the first red flag in its authenticity, said Joel Rollo Coster, medieval history professor at the University of Rhode Island and lead editor of The Cambridge History of the Papacy. The real Malachy knew the Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, an intellectual giant of the 12th century, and a credible witness, Rollo Coster said. Bernard admired Malachy so much that he wrote a biography about him, but never mentioned any prophecy. As an historian, I am hardcore on the evidence, and that, for me, is the ultimate proof that Malachy did not utter prophecies or write prophecies, she said. What do Catholics believe? Pope chosen in conclave will lead one of the largest religions. The so-called prophecy itself is so accurate through the 1580s to 1590s precisely because it wasn't written until then, Weiss argued. Whoever did write it had great historical knowledge of popes and chose Malachy, who was relatively obscure, as a prophet. Weiss said some scholars believe the prophecy was written in support of a cardinal who was campaigning to be the next pope. Granted, some of the predictions since then are strikingly relevant to the popes they align to, Weiss said. For example, the prediction that aligns with Pope John Paul II, 2 popes ago, is, from the labor of the sun. John Paul II, as it happens, was born during a solar eclipse and was buried during a solar eclipse, Weiss said. Others have very little to do with real popes, but believers have tried to fit them into the prophecy by strangulating the evidence, Weiss said. For instance, the swift bear, referring to Pope Clement XIV in the 1700s, has no resemblance to the real man, who was a slow, deliberate and indecisive person, Weiss said. Francis was the 266th pope in Vatican history, but only the 101st pope officially recognized by the Church since Malachy's time. So why do people believe he is the 112th and final pope referenced in the prophecy? That's because there were periods in church history when multiple leaders claimed to be pope at the same time, Weiss said. Believers in Malachi's prophecy include in the count a few of those antipopes, figures not formally recognized by the Vatican. Francis also doesn't really fit the Peter the Roman description. Some believe that because St. Francis of Assisi's father was named Pietro, or Peter, the prophecy still fits, Weiss said. Pope Francis took his papal name from Francis of Assisi. There's also a debated punctuation in the text of the prophecy that some argue suggests there could be an undetermined number of additional popes after the 111th and before Peter the Roman, Weiss said. He thinks it's really just a typo. Francis also doesn't really fit the Peter the Roman description. Some believe that because St. Francis of Assisi's father was named Pietro, or Peter, the prophecy still fits, Weiss said. Pope Francis took his papal name from Francis of Assisi. There's also a debated punctuation in the text of the prophecy that some argue suggests there could be an undetermined number of additional popes after the 111th and before Peter the Roman, Weiss said. He thinks it's really just a typo. Any way you slice it, it's hard to apply logic to something that is inherently illogical, Rollo Coster said. It's difficult because you're just trying to play with numbers and rationalize when it's somebody who is inventing this in the 16th century, she said. A conclave to select a new pope is set to begin May 7, during which cardinals cordoned off within the Sistine Chapel in Rome will cast votes and signal their decisions to the public via colored smoke. They will meet until the next pope has been elected. All signs point to a pope after Francis.